There is one photograph of Lincoln in his casket, one surviving print from a negative that the Secretary of War ordered destroyed. It was taken at New York City Hall on April 24th, 1865, 9 days after Lincoln died. The city had transformed into something between a shrine and a spectacle. Lines stretched for miles in both directions from the entrance. Hundreds of thousands of people had already passed through the doors that day. The photographers were from Gurney & Son, the most prestigious portrait studio in New York, the firm that had photographed everyone worth photographing for 2 decades. When Secretary of War Edwin Stanton learned the image existed, he sent a telegram to General John Adams Dix, the commander of the Department of the East. The negative was to be seized. All prints were to be confiscated. The image was to disappear completely. One print survived in the personal papers of John George Nicolay, Lincoln's private secretary, and stayed there unseen and uncatalogued for decades. It is now in the collection of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois. You can see it if you go there. The photograph shows Lincoln exactly as 1.5 million Americans saw him over 13 days, pale and still, an American flag arranged around his body, the result of a chemical process most Americans had never encountered before the week they encountered it at a public building in their city. What was so dangerous about one photograph of a dead president that the Secretary of War personally intervened to destroy it? The answer has nothing to do with Lincoln and everything to do with what his funeral was actually constructing. Before April 1865, almost no American civilian had ever seen an embalmed body, not because embalming was rare or exotic or associated with distant civilizations, because it did not exist as a commercial practice in this country. When people died in America before the Civil War, the sequence was the same as it had been for centuries. Family members washed and dressed the body. A local cabinet maker built a simple wooden box if the family could afford one, or a neighbor helped if they could not. The body was laid in the parlor, the room in American homes specifically designed for receiving guests in times of crisis, positioned near the front of the house, used only on significant occasions. Neighbors came. The minister came. The body was viewed for a day, sometimes 2, because in warm weather it could not be kept longer without decomposition becoming obvious. Then the family carried it to the churchyard themselves, lowered it into the ground, and the community covered it together. The whole process unfolded inside the community. It cost almost nothing in professional fees because there were no professional fees. There were no professionals. There was no industry. Death was something that happened inside the home, managed by the people who loved the person who had died, completed and returned to the earth within a week. Families had done it this way for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody expected it to change. The Civil War destroyed that system before anyone understood what was being destroyed. Not by design, by logistics. Men were dying hundreds of miles from home, in Virginia and Mississippi and Georgia, in numbers that overwhelmed every local arrangement. The War Department received requests every week from families asking to have their sons shipped home for burial. Shipping a decomposing body on a multi-day rail journey was not possible without chemical preservation. The bodies arrived in conditions that made burial impossible and identification uncertain. Dr. Thomas Holmes understood the commercial opportunity this created before anyone else did. Holmes was a New York physician and chemist who had been experimenting with arterial preservation techniques since the 1840s. When the war began, he traveled to the Union camps and positioned himself near the armies. He embalmed soldiers and arranged their transport home. He charged $100 for officers and $25 for enlisted men. He is estimated to have embalmed approximately 4,000 bodies during the war years. Holmes trained assistants. Those assistants trained others. By 1864, a small but established cohort of commercial embalmers was following the Union Army, operating out of tents and converted wagons, collecting the dead and shipping them northward. Holmes called himself the father of American embalming. By the end of the war, he had earned enough money from battlefield preservation to retire. This was a wartime industry, comprehensible on its own terms. Soldiers died far from home. Families who could pay brought them back. The embalmers who made that possible were operating at the intersection of genuine grief and genuine logistics. By the time the war ended in April 1865, somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 Union dead had been embalmed and shipped home, according to historians of the period. That was a large number by any standard, and it was still a fraction of the total dead. Embalming remained the exception, an emergency measure for extraordinary circumstances. There was no reason to expect it to outlast the emergency that had made it necessary. Then Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theatre on the evening of April 14, 1865. He died at 7:22 in the morning of April 15 in a boarding house across the street. Within hours, Edwin Stanton had taken control of every decision involving Lincoln's body. Stanton was not a sentimental man. He was a precise, cold-minded administrator who had managed the logistics of the largest land war in American history for 4 years. He had a political situation to manage, and he understood it exactly. The president had been assassinated. The nation was in shock. The South had surrendered less than a week earlier. The questions of how to reconstruct the country, how to manage 4 million people just freed from slavery, how to hold a fractured nation together without the president who had promised to do it, none of it had been answered, and Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, was untested and unknown, and already positioning himself against the Reconstruction framework Lincoln had been building. Stanton made a calculation. Lincoln's death could accelerate the fracturing of the country, or it could temporarily bind it. What it could not be was quiet. A quiet funeral, private, local, completed in a week, would have served nobody in the War Department. Stanton needed Lincoln's death to do something specific. He needed it to generate grief so unified and so large that it would create political cover for the Union government to proceed with its agenda. He needed a funeral that the entire country could participate in simultaneously, and he had one tool available that had never existed for a public event of this scale before: the railroad. The plan Stanton organized over the following 48 hours was extraordinary by any standard. Lincoln's body would travel by train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's hometown and the designated burial site, along a route that would pass through 13 major cities. At each stop, the casket would be opened. The public would be admitted. Hundreds of thousands of people would file past. Newspapers would report the crowds and the grief. The mourning would compound from city to city, building across 1,654 miles and 13 days into something national in scale, something that had never happened in American history. It would be the largest public funeral in the country's brief existence. It was also in conception, a government-organized emotional event, engineered by a cabinet secretary to produce a specific political outcome. Mary Todd Lincoln did not accompany the body. She was in severe shock, confined to the White House, and would not emerge publicly for weeks. Robert Lincoln, the eldest surviving son, accompanied the casket, but the decisions, the route, the stops, the timing, the management of the crowds, the choice of what the public would see and when, were Stanton's. For any of it to work, Lincoln's body had to survive 13 days and 1,654 miles of rail travel across a warming spring. That required the same commercial embalmers who had followed the Union Army. The War Department brought in civilian professionals to perform at the White House the procedure that had been refined in battlefield tents and wagons over 4 years of war. Lincoln's body was treated with a preservation method that had not existed in American civilian life a decade earlier. The embalmers who worked on him were from the same small industry that Thomas Holmes had built from nothing during the war. The train left Washington on April 21st, Baltimore first, then Harrisburg, then Philadelphia, where the crowds were so enormous that viewing hours were extended through the night, and people still could not all pass through before the casket had to be closed and moved. New York received Lincoln on April 24th. The lines at City Hall extended for miles. Between 100,000 and 120,000 people viewed the body in a single day. People waited 6 and 7 hours for a moment's view. That was when Gurney and Son took the photograph that Stanton ordered destroyed. Nobody has fully explained what Stanton found so objectionable about the image. Some historians have suggested Lincoln's face had already begun showing signs of deterioration by the time the train reached New York, and that Stanton did not want that documented. By accounts from multiple stops along the journey, Lincoln's complexion was darkening as the days passed. Embalmers had to intervene multiple times along the route, touching up his face and reapplying chemicals to maintain the appearance of peaceful rest. By the time the train reached Illinois, witnesses who had known Lincoln in life described his face as barely recognizable. The embalmers kept working. The casket arrived in Springfield on May 3rd. Lincoln was buried on May 4th. The tour was over. Here is what it had accomplished, beyond the stated purpose of national mourning. 7 million Americans lined the rail route over those 13 days, according to contemporary estimates. Approximately 1.5 million of them walked past the open casket and looked directly at Lincoln's preserved face. For the vast majority of those people, this was the first time in their lives they had seen an embalmed body, not a soldier in a wartime tent, not a scientific demonstration, a man they knew from newspapers, whose face they recognized from portraits, lying preserved and arranged in an expensive display casket, surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements in a public hall, looking as if he were simply sleeping. The visual language was new. The expectation it created was not temporary. In 1882, 17 years after Lincoln's funeral, the National Funeral Directors Association was founded. The organization today represents more than 11,000 funeral homes across the United States. Its annual price survey for 2023 found the median cost of a funeral with viewing and burial at approximately $7,848. Add a burial vault, which most cemeteries require regardless of state law, and the cost rises to approximately $9,420. Add embalming, flowers, obituaries, and transportation, and the average American funeral falls between $10,000 and $15,000 for a middle-income family. The funeral industry in the United States generates somewhere between $16 billion and $20 billion in annual revenue. That figure has grown steadily for decades. Embalming is central to that revenue. The average cost of embalming at an American funeral home ranges from $700 to $1,000 as a separate line item. Most families pay it without question. Most families pay it because they believe it is legally required. The Federal Trade Commission, which regulates the funeral industry under its 1984 funeral rule, has specifically documented this misconception and specifically addressed it. The funeral rule states plainly, embalming is not legally required in most circumstances. No state law in the United States mandates embalming for in-state burial, not one. For interstate transport of remains, certain states have requirements under specific conditions, but for a family burying a relative in the same state where they died, there is no legal mandate for embalming anywhere in America. The FTC rule has been in effect for 40 years. It requires funeral homes to disclose this fact. Most Americans still do not know what it says. The CDC has also addressed the practice directly. The agency has stated that there is no public health justification for requiring embalming of the dead in modern funeral practice. Embalming does not make a body safer to handle. It does not prevent disease transmission. It does not protect cemeteries or communities from contamination. What it does is preserve a body temporarily, for days or weeks, before the preservation itself breaks down and decomposition proceeds on a slightly delayed timeline. There is no documented public health benefit that cold storage, the alternative used in virtually every other developed country, cannot provide equally well at a fraction of the cost. Comparative data on international funeral practices reveals something that should be jarring. In France, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, embalming rates among the general population are in the low single digits as a percentage of funerals. In Australia, the rate is somewhat higher but still a minority practice. The United Kingdom, which has been more exposed to American cultural exports than most European nations, has seen embalming rates climb in recent decades and still sits well below 50%. In North America, embalming is the default. It is what happens unless a family specifically objects and knows enough about the process to object intelligently. The United States is alone in the developed world in treating the chemical preservation of the dead as the standard starting point for a funeral rather than an exception requiring justification. Jessica Mitford saw this clearly before most people were willing to say it. Her 1963 book, The American Way of Death, documented how the funeral industry had transformed a temporary wartime practice into a permanent cultural expectation through deliberate marketing language and the exploitation of grief. Mitford examined internal industry publications and trade school curricula in which funeral directors were trained to describe unembalmed bodies as untreated, to suggest to families that viewing without embalming would be unhygienic, to imply through careful word choice that skipping the procedure would constitute a failure of respect for the deceased. The language did not say embalming was legally required. It did not have to. It positioned the absence of embalming as a moral and hygienic failing in a moment when grieving families were least equipped to push back. Mitford's book prompted the FTC investigation that eventually produced the 1984 funeral rule. The rule was passed. The misconception persisted. The word undertaker, which had been the industry's standard professional title through the 19th century, was deliberately retired by trade associations in the early 20th century. The replacement term, funeral director, was chosen with precision. Undertakers dug graves and built boxes. Directors managed, oversaw, and exercised professional authority. The rebranding was part of a broader campaign to position what had been a local, community-based service as a credentialed profession, requiring specialized training and appropriate compensation. The room where the service was held was no longer the family parlor but the funeral parlor, then the funeral home, then the funeral chapel. Each step moved the rituals of death further from the family and further toward the professional. Each step was accompanied by a corresponding increase in what families were expected to pay. The NFDA's own institutional histories acknowledge the Civil War embalming period as foundational to the development of the profession. What they do not frame as a founding event, though the timeline makes it unmistakable, is Lincoln's funeral tour. Before that tour, embalming was a wartime service used by a small fraction of families who had the means and the specific need. After it, embalming had been witnessed as a civic ritual by 7 million Americans, who then went home and told everyone else what they had seen. The education of an entire generation in the expectation of preserved, displayed bodies happened in 13 days in the spring of 1865, not through advertising, not through legislation, through the experience of standing in a line that stretched for miles to see a president. I spent 3 weeks with this research before I could write a word, not because the evidence was complicated. The FTC documents are public, the CDC position is public, the NFDA's membership numbers and price surveys are published annually. The comparative international embalming data exists across multiple academic and industry sources. The historical record connecting the Civil War embalming industry to the Lincoln funeral to the founding of the NFDA is in the NFDA's own materials. Every thread leads to the same place. What stopped me was a quieter and more unsettling question underneath the economic one. Stanton made a decision in April 1865 to display Lincoln's body across 14 cities for a specific political purpose. The 1.5 million Americans who filed past the casket did not choose to be introduced to embalming as a civic practice. They were introduced to it because the Secretary of War needed to manufacture national grief on a specific timeline to serve a specific political goal. The industry that grew from that introduction has spent 160 years collecting money from families who believe they are following a tradition as old as death itself. What they are following is a government-organized product demonstration from April 1865, and nobody involved in that demonstration had to plan any of it beyond the original 13 days. The economics did the rest by themselves. There is a pattern in the American historical record that this research returns to again and again, and it becomes visible clearly here. A crisis moment creates a new practice. The practice is introduced without public deliberation, under emergency conditions, by a small group with concentrated authority. The crisis that introduced it creates the emotional or institutional conditions for its rapid adoption. Within a generation, the practice has been normalized to the point where it feels permanent and pre-existing, and the industry that forms around it lobbies, maneuvers, and markets itself to ensure the normalization is never examined. The stated reason the practice exists stops being questioned because the practice itself has become so embedded in the cultural ritual that questioning it feels like questioning grief itself. That is the specific machinery of how a commercial service becomes a moral category. The funeral industry's structural interest is in ensuring that you believe embalming is necessary, not legally required. They know you could check that, but emotionally and morally necessary. That the alternative is somehow disrespectful, that viewing without embalming reflects insufficient love. The language funeral directors are trained to use when families inquire about alternatives describes embalming as giving your loved one dignity, not as a billable preservation procedure, as dignity. And dignity is not a thing families in grief find themselves in a position to refuse. The FTC has tried to pierce that framing with regulation. The 1984 funeral rule requires itemized pricing and explicit disclosure that embalming is not legally required. It does not require the disclosure to be prominent. It does not require the funeral director to lead with it. It does not require them to present refrigeration as a fully equivalent and far cheaper alternative. It requires a line somewhere in a folder of paperwork that can be handed to a family in the first hours after someone they love died. Mitford tried to pierce the framing with journalism 60 years ago and succeeded well enough to force the FTC rule. The rule has been in effect for 4 decades. Ask 10 people on the street whether embalming is legally required in America. Count how many say yes. The industry has maintained the impression through an infrastructure of implication, professional language, and cultural inertia that no disclosure requirement has managed to dismantle. Because the disclosure cannot dismantle what was not built by a disclosure. It was built by 7 million people standing along a rail line in April 1865, watching a train carry a dead president through their city, reading newspaper accounts of the open casket and the mourning crowds at every stop, absorbing without being told directly that this was what respect for the dead looked like in America. That impression does not come out of a folder. It comes from a culture that has spent 160 years replicating the template Stanton designed for political purposes, because nobody who built an industry around that template has had any financial reason to explain where the template came from. Now consider what happened to Lincoln's body after the burial. Because the story does not end at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield on May 4, 1865. In November 1876, 11 years after the funeral tour, a gang of counterfeiters operating out of Chicago decided to steal Lincoln's body from the tomb. The plan was organized by a man named James Kennelly and was straightforward in its logic: remove Lincoln's lead-lined casket, transport it to the Indiana sand dunes along the Lake Michigan shore, and hold it until the federal government paid $200,000 in ransom and released from prison their colleague and master engraver, Benjamin Boyd. The Secret Service had infiltrated the gang with an informant named Louis Swegels. The conspirators were arrested inside Lincoln's tomb at night with the casket already partially removed from its marble housing. They were caught in the act, which was also the act that revealed something about Lincoln's burial that nobody in official Washington had fully confronted. The body was not safe. The monument and the locked iron door were not enough. The tomb could be breached by men with tools and a plan. The penalty for the body theft attempt was 1 year in prison. That was the maximum sentence available under the applicable Illinois statute, which addressed conspiracy to commit grave robbery as a misdemeanor. 1 year for attempting to ransom the body of the assassinated president. The sentencing revealed something about the legal architecture surrounding the dead in America. It had not been designed with this kind of situation in mind, because this kind of situation had not existed before. The funeral industry that was already forming had no corresponding infrastructure for protecting the bodies it preserved and displayed. After the theft attempt, Lincoln's casket was quietly moved to a hidden location in the basement of the tomb. The public was not informed. The display position was left empty while officials argued about what to do. The body was moved again and again. By the end of the sequence, Lincoln had been relocated 17 times. In September 1901, Robert Lincoln, the last surviving son, then 60 years old, made the decision to end the uncertainty permanently. Workers opened the outer marble sarcophagus. They cut through the lead lining of the inner casket. A group of approximately 23 witnesses gathered in the tomb to see what remained of Abraham Lincoln after 36 years. They found his features still recognizable, darkened but intact. His black suit was still on him. His white gloves had deteriorated. A yellowish mold covered the clothing and the exposed surfaces of the casket's interior. One witness at that opening, a young man named Fleetwood Lindley, who was 13 years old when he stood in that tomb, gave an account to a reporter in 1963, more than 60 years later, shortly before his own death. He said Lincoln looked like a wax figure. He said he was not frightened. He said he had not spoken of it to anyone in all the intervening years. After the witnesses had seen what they came to see, Lincoln's casket was lowered into a cage of iron bars embedded in the floor of the monument. Workers poured concrete around it in layers. The concrete was poured to a depth of 10 feet beneath the floor. A 2-ton block of granite was placed above the concrete as a final seal. They encased him as thoroughly as the earth could hold anything. Think about what that burial sequence represents alongside everything else. The man whose death launched the American funeral industry, whose open casket was displayed to 1.5 million people across 1,654 miles of track, whose preserved face became the image that normalized the chemical preparation of the dead for an entire generation of Americans. That man's body required 17 relocations, survived an attempted theft, and ultimately needed reinforced concrete and a 2-ton stone to stay undisturbed. The industry that grew from displaying his body sells families the promise of a dignified and permanent final resting place. Lincoln's own resting place took 36 years and 10 feet of concrete to achieve. There is still a funeral home in your city. There is still a casket displayed in a showroom in a range of prices ascending from basic to premium, and a funeral director who will guide a grieving family through the options using language calibrated to make the expensive choices feel like the respectful choices. There is still an embalming table in a room that families never see, operated by a licensed embalmer whose professional certification traces through trade schools and licensing boards back to the industry that Thomas Holmes founded on Civil War battlefields. There is still a line item on the invoice that uses the word dignity in its phrasing, regardless of the specific language the particular funeral home prefers. And there is still, somewhere in the folder of paperwork, the FTC-mandated disclosure that embalming is not required by law, printed in the same font as everything else, positioned where it is unlikely to be read first, surrounded by arrangements a family in the first hours of grief will not be inclined to dispute. The photograph Stanton ordered destroyed is in Springfield. You can see it if you go there. It shows Lincoln as 1.5 million Americans saw him, arranged for viewing, surrounded by flags, the result of a procedure that did not exist in American civilian life before the week it was performed on him. 7 million people stood along those tracks. They were not asked whether they wanted to be introduced to a new standard for how Americans should handle their dead. They were shown the standard. Their children grew up expecting funerals to resemble what they had heard about from parents who had stood in those lines. Their grandchildren inherited the expectation as tradition, and somewhere in the passage of 160 years, the expectation became an industry, and the industry became a professional association, and the association became a lobby, and the lobby ensured that the disclosure which technically tells you none of this is required is printed in a folder handed to you when you are least prepared to read anything carefully. The last person known to have seen Lincoln's face was 13 years old in 1901. He waited 62 years to tell anyone what he saw. He said the man looked like wax. He said he had kept the silence so long it had simply become his silence. The body has been under 10 feet of concrete for 123 years. The industry that grew from the week of its display is still running, still growing, still collecting somewhere around $20 billion from American families every year. The FTC rule that tells you the truth is still in the fine print. Nobody leads with it. Nobody volunteers it. The standard it was written to correct is the one that Stanton established in April 1865 for a political purpose that has been accomplished and forgotten, while the commercial practice it incidentally created has never stopped collecting. The question is not whether you know this now. You know it now. The question is what you will do with the knowledge the next time you are handed a folder in a quiet room by a professional whose language has been carefully calibrated to make 160 years of institutional inertia feel like a choice you are making freely out of love. It was never a choice. It was a train that left Washington on a cold spring morning and did not stop for 1,654 miles, opening the casket at every city along the way, teaching 7 million people what grief was supposed to look like in America, teaching them so thoroughly that the lesson has never had to be taught again. It has simply been inherited, generation by generation, as if it had always been true. It was 13 days in 1865. It became everything after.